make this decision. Do you want to write free software as in free of cost for its users, or do you actually want to write free and open software as in freedom? The problem was he was using a very weak license, namely the MIT license. Don't use the MIT license if you don't want others to profit from your ideas, from your intellectual property. Ultimately, it's not worth it. Stop wasting your life writing free software for corporations who don't pay you well, who don't give you anything in return. Alright, welcome everybody to Get Good. Today I want to talk about something else, about a topic or a news story that came up in the developer circles. There was this famous JavaScript library called Faker.js, and its maintainer, whose name I will not mention in this video, decided to take down the source code from GitHub and replace it with a single text file that contained the sentence, "What really happened to Aaron Swartz?" Well, I think everyone should already know what the whole story about Aaron Swartz was about. So yeah, it's certainly a bit surprising that the maintainer of Faker.js did this, but in this video I want to explore why this happened, how you can avoid this if you're working on open source software yourself, and what the consequences of this might be. Alright, let me start with a short recap. So, this guy develops this very useful tool, this very useful JavaScript library that lets you quickly, mock fake data. You can quickly design fake, let's say, user accounts that look exactly the way you expect them to look like in your future product, and then you can quickly mock fake data with this library. It generates it all. It's a really nice tool actually. At some point he realizes that there is no money to be made in his strategy. He didn't have a plan for further down the road. He got cranky as others weren't giving him free services and didn't accept their applause as a payment method. He wanted to get paid for his work after spending, according to him, a decade maintaining this software. And to quote him directly, he said, "Respectfully, I'm no longer going to support Fortune 500s and other smaller sized companies with my free work. There isn't much else to say. Take this as an opportunity to send me a 6-figure yearly contract or fork the project and have someone else work on it." Of course, this didn't happen. They didn't offer him a 6-figure contract. So what did he do? Well, he launched a SaaS version of this library on fakercloud.com. And, SaaS is a popular strategy to make money for small developers, for big corporations. And it can actually work. You can make some money like this. But the problem was he was using a very permissible, very free, very weak license, namely the MIT license. And what happened? According to him, some engineers at a company that I will not mention copied his SaaS offering. That's at least what he claimed had happened. And after he realized that, he tried to sell his own version of the SaaS offering to this company, but the CEO of this company apparently ghosted the maintainer of the library, and this maybe happened because, they didn't want to provide any evidence for a potential lawsuit, so they just ghosted him and they went with their own version of it. And this resulted in the maintainer actually taking down the code from GitHub. But what happened then? Well, NPM, of course, the large registry that is used by most developers, most web developers, I would say, to distribute and receive node packages. Well, they just suspended his account and they continued to provide the version that has worked before he decided to pull his source code from the internet. So, yeah, I don't know what to say. Maybe it was a precaution by NPM, Many maintainers don't use two-factor authentication. They can be hacked, and to be honest, this all looked like a hack. I mean, he replaced the whole source code with a single text file saying, what really happened to Aaron Swartz. So I think you can't blame NPM or GitHub. NPM restored the previous version because it all looked like a hack. And, many products, many corporations, developers, small businesses, they all depended on his code. Of course, probably not in production since it generates fake data, but still, I mean, with 1.7 million downloads per week on average, it is a very widely used piece of software, and just pulling it, it's you have to have balls to do this, but it's also a pretty stupid move, to be honest. So, what can we learn from this? Well, in my first video on this channel, I was preaching that you should never try to look for appreciation within the system. And what do I mean by this? Well, in this case, the maintainer of the package was looking for appreciation from within the system. He wanted to get paid by maybe the community, maybe the large corporate users of this software. Maybe he wanted to get a job. He wanted to feel accomplished. And the way he wanted to get there was through the appreciation by others. But that's exactly what you should never try to do. Instead, when writing open source software, there are two or maybe two routes to go, and one additional route, of course, being to write proprietary software. So, what is the decision that you have to make when you want to write open source software or when you want to write software in general? Well, I would say the first step is to make a plan. Make this decision. Do you want to write free software as in free of cost for its users, or do you actually want to write free and open software as in freedom? And of course, the third option being, do you want to write proprietary software and, keep the change not distributed for free? That's also an option. But let's say you want to go for the open source route and you don't want that something like this can happen to you if your product becomes popular down the road. So, a few things that I can recommend to avoid this happening to you. First of all, help yourself and then help others. What do I mean by this? Seemingly, this guy was very frustrated for not being compensated appropriately. So, if you're struggling in life financially, why would you waste your whole life writing open source software, not getting paid for it? Why would you choose a license like the MIT license in the first place? That was his biggest mistake, of course. And of course, it's easy to say this in hindsight, but still, you have to help yourself first and then help others. This means make a living for yourself, then decide if you want to help others, if you want to maintain open source software. Of course, sometimes it's a very noble idea. You want to contribute to open source. We all know that urge, but you have to look after yourself before you bring yourself into a situation like this. Alright, so how can you actually monetize open source software? Well, either you get a job in a company that contributes to open source and you do it through them, and you don't care that you're not, the owner of the copyright because you just want to write open source software. But in that case, of course, somebody else will monetize your software. So if you don't want to do that, then you have other options. For example, you can promise new features for donations to your users. You can, for example, mention your patrons in your product, in your credits. People will actually pay quite some money if you provide a good product. Sadly, in the case of Faker.js, this apparently wasn't the case. People just, used the software to generate some fake data and then they forget about it, So you really have to think about these things before you spend a decade programming this software. But let's get back to the core of the problem. Don't use the MIT license if you don't want others to profit from your ideas, from your intellectual property, because you cannot blame them. You officially forfeited all of your rights. so you can't complain. You know, nowadays all the kids use the MIT license because it sounds cool, you know, like, oh, I go to a shitty university, but if I choose the MIT license, it looks like, you know, I'm the cool kid. No, it's not. You have to think about it, because this guy, he pretty much wasted his whole career maintaining 1 or 2 packages, and now this happens to him. You don't want this to happen to you. So what can you do? Practically speaking, you can choose a strong copyleft license like AGPL v3, or in this case even SSPL, even though of course some corporate advocates may argue that these ones are not true open source licenses, but they are. So if you don't want big corporations stealing projects from you, just use these licenses. Nowadays, SaaS is a common way of monetizing, even for big corporations. I mentioned that before. So if you don't want that someone takes your code and makes a SaaS offering from it and excludes you from the credits, excludes you from the profit, then just use these licenses. And why especially the AGPL license? Well, if you just use the GPL license, there is one big difference to the AGPL license. Namely, the AGPL license contains another clause which forces adopters of your software to distribute their versions of the software down the line freely if the software is used, and I quote, to interact remotely through a computer network. And this clause was supposedly written like this to include SaaS, and is very likely to protect your software from such overtaking. But you might say, well, if I choose such a strong license, nobody will use my software. But I don't think so. That's actually completely wrong, because AGPL doesn't specify any conditions if you don't want to distribute or modify the code, meaning that even as the largest corporation in the world, if you just use this software, you can freely use it. Nobody will stop you from it. It's completely free. You don't have to worry about it. You only have to follow the rules if you modify the code. So, some corporations or some companies will use your software and be happy, while others will still avoid it like the plague, of course, just because for them it's a simple cost-benefit analysis. You have to think about it like this. For corporations, the use of open source software is actually not free, as you might think, because even if the license explicitly states that the usage is completely free, that's not the case, practically speaking. And you might ask, why is that so? Well, I can tell you what I know. One of the main costs of using open source software in corporate environments is the existing compliance process. And it's very hard for a corporation to make sure that nobody commits an error while using a AGPL licensed software, meaning that it's very hard to control that someone will actually only use the software and not modify it by accident, which would of course violate the license. So it adds a whole new layer to the existing compliance process, or it even introduces a compliance process that wasn't there before. Many companies will just not use your software, and that's fine, but others who don't intend profiting from it, who don't intend editing the source code, they will just use it and be happy. If that's what you want, then you have to just use these licenses and not the MIT license. You can make thousands and thousands of smaller businesses, even local and smaller chains, happy users of your software. Maybe they even wanna contribute to it, whatever, but you will probably scare away the big fish who plan on making a SaaS offering out of it and excluding you from the profits. Ultimately, this sounds like I'm very against corporations, which is not the case. I'm actually myself employed at a big tech company that contributes a lot to open source, and I really like the idea. It's not that I'm against the corporations. In fact, I think that this maintainer ultimately got what he deserved because he offered it for free, so the corporations cannot be blamed in this case. They just did what was actually allowed. I mean, how can you blame a company to do what you have explicitly allowed them to do? It doesn't make any sense. There's no hate against the corporations. I think that many big corporations do a lot of great open source work. I just don't like the idea, you know, when individuals like this oftentimes get left out. So this is why I'm making this video, so that you, the viewer who sees this right now and who writes maybe a popular library in 3 or 4 or 5 years down the line, then you can say, oh well, I did the right choice. I chose a license that makes sense for me. And of course, if you're good with companies making profit with your intellectual property, which at that point is not your property anymore, but you get what I'm saying. Like, if you're okay that companies make profit with your inventions, that's also completely fine. Many people enjoy this process, and I can see why this is attractive for some developers. I mean, you get the fame, you get the internet fame, you get the recognition. Like, many doors will open for you if you're a good open source contributor. I mean, if you send your resume to any of the big companies and they see that you've developed a library and you maintain it and it has like 1 million weekly downloads, you will get hired on the spot. You can make your 6 figures easily. So what's the problem? But don't come back and complain and pull the code from the internet and say like, oh, they stole it from me. No, they didn't steal it. They just did what you allowed them to do. And some more pieces of advice to everyone who doesn't want this happen to them. Just avoid these big centralized places if you don't want other people taking ownership of your software. I mean, for NPM it's kind of hard because it's a large ecosystem. It will sooner or later have to end up there if you want to make it usable, but GitHub in his terms of service explicitly states that they can terminate your account at any time without any notice, and you don't control that. So they can just terminate your account. If the license was weak, someone else will take over the project, fork it, and it's gone. If you're serious about the distribution of your open source software, choose an alternative. Think about it. Host your own server. It's not that hard. You know, back in the days, this was actually really hard to do. Nobody could just pull the whole source code from the internet and cause havoc across the planet like it happened with LeftPad, where the developer just pulled it from NPM and caused millions of servers to go down. This is actually just a stupid move. Like, if you have to think about this beforehand. If you're not happy with your license, then it's already too late. You cannot just pull the code from the internet, cause all kinds of production servers to break and cause that much damage. It's just stupid, you know, it's so childish. So instead, even as a user of open source software, don't be this dependent on a single point of failure. If you need reliable services, then make your own registry, keep them in a separate place, make them available to your own services. Of course, don't modify them if it's not allowed, but this is how you can be less dependent and more safe from such things happening to you. I think ultimately it's not worth it. Stop wasting your life writing free software for corporations who don't pay you well, who don't give you anything in return. At the end, you won't even get an attribution or a thank you. We've seen even cases where the name of the person who actually wrote the license just got removed and replaced by the name of a certain corporation. I won't name anyone in this video. I don't want to give anyone, you know, ground for any kind of claims against me or whatever. So yeah, I would say the biggest thing is think ahead, do what's good for you, and then do what's good for others. Having said that, thanks everyone. Thanks for watching my video. I hope to see you around next time. Bye bye.